Sometimes life breaks you down so completely that you'll do anything for a second chance at love and family. Sometimes you find yourself so alone that you'll risk everything on a stranger's promise of hope. In the mining town of Silver Hollow, 1876, Eliza Holt did exactly that. She was a woman of 44 with no family left and a plot of wild land she couldn't tame alone. At the town's bachelor auction, she shocked everyone by bidding on Elias, a towering mountain man who'd lived in the wilderness for decades. He was rough, scarred, and half-wild. She was desperate, determined, and had nothing left to lose. Neither expected what happened next. Could two broken souls really build a life together from nothing but hope and hard work? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The weathered land deed lay folded in Eliza Holt's calloused hands, its edges soft from handling and worry. 160 acres of mountain territory that stretched from Devil's Creek to the pine ridgeland that had claimed her husband's life and now threatened to claim her spirit. She sat on the sagging porch of her cabin, watching the October sun paint the peaks in shades of copper and gold, and wondered how many more sunsets she'd see before the wilderness finally won. 3 years had passed since the fever took Thomas, little Mary, and baby Samuel within a span of 10 terrible days. 3 years since she'd buried them in the grove behind the cabin, marking their graves with stones she'd carried herself from the creek bed. 3 years of trying to work land meant for stronger hands and broader shoulders, watching her crops fail and her hopes wither like autumn leaves. Silver Hollow sprawled in the valley below, a collection of ramshackle buildings and determined souls clinging to the mountainside like barnacles on a ship's hull. Smoke rose from a dozen chimneys, and even from her distant perch, Eliza could hear the rhythmic pounding of the stamp mill crushing ore. The town had grown since the silver strike of '73, drawing men with strong backs and weak morals from every corner of the territory. Most came seeking fortune, most left with empty pockets and broken dreams. Mayor Hutchins had visited twice this month, his round face creased with what he called concern, but Eliza recognized as calculation. "Now, Mrs. Holt," he'd say, removing his hat and wiping his brow. "You know we all admired Thomas, God rest his soul, but this land's too much for a woman alone. Sell to the mining company. Take the money and move to Denver, start fresh where life's easier." Easier. The word tasted bitter as unripe persimmons. Thomas had dreamed of this place becoming something grander ranch that would feed the growing town, children running through fields of corn and wheat, grandchildren learning to milk cows and mend fences. She still wore his gold wedding band on a chain around her neck, feeling its weight against her heart with every breath. The cabin itself seemed to sag under the burden of memories. 2 rooms and a loft, built from logs Thomas had cut himself during their first summer. The chinking needed repair, the roof leaked when the wind blew hard from the north, and the front step had developed a dangerous tilt. But it was home, the only home her children had ever known, the place where she'd sung lullabies and mended scraped knees, and watched her babies take their first steps across the uneven plank floor. Martha Kellerman, who ran the Lucky Strike Saloon, had become her closest friend in these lean years. A woman of similar age with steel-grey hair and kind eyes that had seen too much of the world's hard edges, Martha understood loss in ways the younger women couldn't. She'd buried 2 husbands herself, one to a mining accident, another to the bottle, and had learned to survive by her wits and determination. "You're killing yourself up there," Martha had said just last week, sitting at Eliza's kitchen table with a cup of bitter coffee between her weathered hands. "When's the last time you had a decent meal? When's the last time you slept through the night without worrying about wolves or claimed jumpers or the roof caving in?" Eliza had no good answers. The truth was, she couldn't remember sleeping peacefully since Thomas died. Every creak of the cabin walls, every rustle in the brush outside, every cry of the night birds sent her reaching for the old Sharps rifle propped beside her bed. She'd learned to shoot well enough. Thomas had insisted on that, but marksmanship couldn't plant crops or repair fences or haul water from the creek when the well ran dry. Young Ben Morrison, barely 18 and full of dreams of striking it rich, had offered to help with the heavier work in exchange for meals and a place to sleep. His earnestness reminded her painfully of Thomas at that age, all broad grins and confident plans. But Ben had his own claim to work, his own hopes to chase, and she couldn't ask him to shoulder her burdens along with his own. The bachelor auction had been Martha's idea, presented with the casual air of discussing the weather. "It's not about romance, honey," she'd said, stirring sugar into her coffee with deliberate precision. "It's about partnership, survival. These mountain men understand hard work and harsh winters. Some of them are decent enough sorts, just lonely as you are." Eliza had laughed, actually laughed at the suggestion. The idea of standing in the town square, bidding on a man like he was livestock at market, seemed absurd beyond measure. But as the days passed and the first snow dusted the peaks, the absurd began to seem merely practical. The legend of Elias grew in the telling, as legends do in small towns hungry for stories. Some said he stood 7 feet tall and could track a deer through solid rock. Others claimed he'd lived in the mountains for 20 years, speaking only to his horses and the wind. The more dramatic storytellers whispered that he'd been a soldier once, or an outlaw, or a man who'd made a bargain with the devil himself for the ability to survive where others perished. Martha had seen him once, during one of his rare visits to town for supplies. "Big as a house and twice as solid," she'd reported. "Didn't say much, but his eyes are good. Sad, but good. He paid his debts and minded his business. That's more than you can say for half the men in this territory." The thought of approaching such a man, of proposing the kind of arrangement she had in mind, sent heat flooding through her cheeks and made her hands shake. But the alternative, watching her dreams crumble while she slowly starved or froze, seemed far worse than embarrassment. Silver Hollow's bachelor auctions had become a monthly tradition, drawing eligible women from neighboring settlements and curious onlookers from miles around. The October auction promised to be the largest yet, with 7 bachelors signed up and word spreading as far as Leadville and Georgetown. Mayor Hutchins had grand plans for the event, seeing it as a way to attract more families to the area and prove that Silver Hollow was becoming a civilized community. Eliza had spent 3 sleepless nights deciding what to wear, finally settling on her dark blue dress, the one Thomas had always admired with her mother's pearl brooch at the throat. She'd counted and recounted her meager savings, $43 in silver and gold, earned by selling eggs and vegetables to the miners' wives. It wasn't much, but it might be enough. Most of the women came seeking companionship and someone to share domestic duties. Few were prepared to bid high for a man they'd never properly met. The morning of the auction dawned clear and cold, with frost painting intricate patterns on the cabin windows. Eliza fed her chickens and milked her lone cow, tasks that had become meditation over the years. Her hands knew the work so well that her mind was free to wander, to imagine, to plan for possibilities that seemed both terrifying and necessary. She hitched her mare to the small wagon and began the winding descent to town, the land deed tucked safely in her coat pocket alongside her small store of coins. The weight of both seemed heavier than they should, carrying as they did the burden of her past and the uncertain promise of her future. Silver Hollow buzzed with excitement as she arrived. Banners stretched across Main Street, and someone had set up wooden benches in the town square. The smell of roasting meat and fresh bread drifted from Martha's place, mixing with the ever-present scent of wood smoke and mountain air. Children darted between the adults, their laughter bright as silver coins, while their mothers gossiped and speculated about the day's events. Eliza tied her horse to the hitching post and smoothed her skirts, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Somewhere in this crowd of eager faces and curious strangers was the man she hoped might be her salvationer, her final mistake. The auction gavel sat heavy in Mayor Hutchins' hand, its worn wooden handle polished smooth by years of use in town meetings and land disputes. Today it would serve a different purpose, joining lives instead of settling arguments, though Eliza suspected there might not be much difference between the two. A makeshift platform had been erected in the town square, decorated with autumn leaves and late-blooming wildflowers that did little to soften its resemblance to a livestock auction block. 7 bachelors stood in an awkward line to one side, ranging from young Pete Sanders, barely old enough to shave, to grizzled old Cornelius Walsh, whose best years were decades behind him. They shuffled their feet and tugged at their clean shirts, most looking like they'd rather face a charging bear than the crowd of appraising women. Eliza positioned herself near the back, close enough to see but far enough to avoid the curious stares, and whispered comments that followed her like shadows. She recognized most of the other women miners' wives who'd brought sisters or cousins from back east, young ladies from neighboring towns seeking husbands and adventure, widows like herself, though none quite so desperate. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mayor Hutchins began, his voice carrying across the square with practiced authority. "Welcome to Silver Hollow's October Bachelor Auction. Today we celebrate the fine tradition of bringing together good men and worthy women in the spirit of Christian partnership and community building." The crowd murmured appreciatively, though Eliza noticed several of the bachelors looked ready to bolt. She understood the feeling. Her own hands trembled as she clutched her small purse, the coins inside seeming to burn through the leather. Young Pete went first, red-faced and stammering through his introduction. He worked at the general store, lived with his mother, and enjoyed fishing and whittling. The bidding was gentle, almost motherly, with Mrs. Henderson from the next valley winning him for $12. Pete looked relieved rather than romantic as he joined her on the platform. Cornelius Walsh attracted no bids at all, which surprised no one. 2 middle-aged miners found wives for reasonable sums, their new partnerships greeted with applause and good-natured ribbing from the crowd. The atmosphere was festive, almost carnival-like, but Eliza felt her nerves tightening with each passing moment. Then Mayor Hutchins called a name that sent a ripple of excitement through the gathered crowd: Elias Morrison. A collective intake of breath followed as the mountain man stepped forward. Eliza had heard the stories, but seeing him in person struck her speechless. He stood well over 6 feet, with shoulders that strained the seams of his clean but simple clothes. His dark hair hung to his collar, shot through with premature grey, and a thick beard covered most of his face. But it was his eyes that captured her attention, grey as storm clouds, steady and watchful, carrying a depth of solitude that spoke to something broken in her own heart. He didn't introduce himself with words. Instead, he simply nodded to the crowd, his presence commanding attention without effort. Mayor Hutchins, clearly flustered by the man's silence, began listing what he knew. Mr. Morrison is a skilled trapper and woodsman, familiar with every inch of these mountains. He's proven his ability to survive in conditions that would challenge any man, and his reputation for honesty is without question. The bidding began immediately, with eager voices calling out offers: $5 from a young woman near the front, $8 from a widow with 3 children who needed a father, $10 from the schoolteacher, Miss Patterson, who'd been eyeing Elias with obvious appreciation. Eliza watched the numbers climb, her heart sinking with each new bid: $15, $20, $25. The coins in her purse suddenly seemed pitifully inadequate. She'd known this was a long shot, but desperation had made her foolish. $30, called out Mrs. Abernathy, a formidable woman whose late husband had left her a successful dry goods business. The crowd gasped. $30 was more than most miners earned in 2 months. Mayor Hutchins raised his gavel, scanning the crowd for further bids. $30 going once. Something inside Eliza snapped. Perhaps it was the sight of Elias standing silent and dignified, while strangers haggled over him like prize cattle. Perhaps it was the memory of Thomas's dreams for their land, withering because she lacked the strength to make them real. Perhaps it was simply the recognition that this moment might be her last chance at something beyond mere survival. $43, she called out, her voice carrying across the square with startling clarity. The silence that followed was so complete that Eliza could hear the wind rattling the leaves overhead. Every head turned toward her, eyes wide with shock and speculation. Mrs. Abernathy's mouth fell open. Even Elias himself seemed surprised, those storm-grey eyes finding hers across the crowd. "Did she say $43?" Someone whispered loudly enough for half the town to hear. Mayor Hutchins cleared his throat, clearly flustered. "Mrs. Holt, are you certain?" $43, Eliza repeated, stepping forward through the parting crowd. Her legs felt unsteady, but her voice remained firm. "And I'm not looking for a husband, Mr. Morrison. I'm looking for a partner." The crowd erupted in whispers and gasps. This was unprecedented, a woman openly declaring her intentions, speaking to the man directly instead of through the auctioneer. Several of the town's more proper ladies looked scandalized. Elias studied her with those penetrating eyes, taking in her simple dress, her work-worn hands, the determined set of her jaw. When he spoke, his voice was deep and rough from disuse, like stones grinding together in a creek bed. What kind of partner? The question hung in the air between them, weighted with possibility and danger. Eliza felt the entire town holding its breath, waiting for her answer. This was the moment when she could back down, make some polite excuse, and retreat to her failing homestead to face slow starvation alone. Or she could leap into the unknown. The kind who needs 160 acres of mountain land turned into something worthwhile, she said, her voice carrying across the silent square. The kind who can cook and sew and keep accounts, but can't fell trees or break horses or fight off claim jumpers. The kind who'll work beside you from dawn to dusk and ask for nothing more than an honest day's effort in return. Elias continued studying her, and Eliza felt heat rising in her cheeks under his scrutiny. She'd laid her cards on the table, revealed her desperation to the entire town. If he rejected her offer now, she'd become the subject of gossip and pity for months to come. "And if it doesn't work out?" he asked quietly. "Then we part ways with no hard feelings and no promises broken," Eliza replied. "But it will work out, Mr. Morrison, because it has to." Another long silence stretched between them while the crowd watched like spectators at a dramatic play. Then Elias nodded once, a brief dip of his head that somehow carried the weight of a sworn oath. "Accepted," he said simply. Mayor Hutchins, clearly uncertain about the propriety of the entire exchange, raised his gavel with obvious reluctance. Going once, going twice, sold to Mrs. Eliza Holt for $43. The gavel fell with a decisive crack that seemed to echo off the surrounding mountains, sealing a bargain that would change 2 lives forever. Scattered applause rose from the crowd, mixed with excited chatter as people tried to process what they'd just witnessed. Eliza walked to the platform on unsteady legs, pulling the coins from her purse with hands that shook only slightly. As she counted out the money to Mayor Hutchins, Elias stepped down to stand beside her, his presence both comforting and overwhelming. "When do we start?" he asked quietly, his words meant for her ears alone. "Tomorrow," Eliza replied without hesitation, "if you're ready." "I'm ready," he said, and something in his tone made her believe it might actually be true. As the crowd began to disperse and the other successful couples made their own arrangements, Eliza found herself standing beside a man she barely knew, bound to him by nothing more than $43 and a desperate hope. It was either the smartest decision she'd ever made or the most foolish. Only time would tell which. Elias's trapping knife hung at his hip like an extension of his body, its worn leather sheath dark with age and constant use. The blade had seen him through 20 winters in the high country, and as he followed Eliza's wagon up the winding mountain path to her homestead, he found its familiar weight oddly comforting. Change was coming. He could feel it in his bones like an approaching storm, but some things remained constant. The woman riding ahead of him sat straight-backed, despite the wagon's jolting passage over rocks and ruts. She hadn't spoken much during the ride from town, occasionally pointing out landmarks or warning him about washouts in the trail, but otherwise keeping her own counsel. He respected that. Too many people felt the need to fill silence with empty chatter, as if words could somehow make the unknown less frightening. When they crested the final ridge and her land spread out before them, Elias pulled his horse to a halt and studied the terrain with a trapper's practiced eye. The location was well chosen, high enough to avoid the worst of the spring floods, protected from winter winds by the pine ridge to the north, with good water from the creek that meandered through the valley floor. Thomas Holt had known what he was about when he'd staked this claim. But 3 years of neglect had taken their toll. The cabin hunched in a clearing like a wounded animal, its roof sagging and several window shutters hanging askew. What had once been cultivated fields were now overgrown with brush and weeds. A chicken coop listed dangerously to one side, and the barn door gaped open, revealing the emptiness within. "It's not much to look at right now," Eliza said quietly, following his gaze across the property, "but it could be something fine with the right attention." Elias nodded, seeing past the decay to the potential beneath. The soil was rich, he could tell by the lushness of the wild growth. The water source was reliable, the timber plentiful, the grazing adequate for livestock. A man could make a good life here with enough determination and sweat. "Show me the boundaries," he said, dismounting from his horse with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to spending more time in the saddle than on foot. They spent the better part of an hour walking the property lines, Eliza pointing out the markers Thomas had set and explaining his plans for each section. Her knowledge of the land impressed him. She understood drainage and wind patterns, knew which areas flooded in spring and which stayed dry through the worst droughts. This wasn't a woman who'd simply inherited property she couldn't manage. This was someone who'd worked alongside her husband and learned from him. The cabin itself was sturdy enough, built from good timber with proper foundations. The roof needed work, several shingles had blown away, and the chimney required repointing, but nothing that couldn't be fixed before winter set in hard. Inside, the rooms were clean but sparse, furnished with handmade pieces that spoke of a family's careful economy. "You can have the loft," Eliza said, gesturing toward the ladder that led to the space under the eaves. "It's not much, but it's private and warm enough, with the stove going below." Elias climbed up to examine his new quarters, noting the narrow bed with its simple mattress and the small window that looked out toward the mountains. He'd slept in far worse places, cave mouths and lean-to shelters, beneath overhanging rocks with nothing but his horse blanket for warmth. This felt luxurious by comparison. When he came back down, Eliza was standing by the cold stove, her hands clasped in front of her like a schoolgirl, reciting a difficult lesson. The afternoon light filtering through the windows cast her face in soft shadows, revealing the lines that worry and loss had etched around her eyes. "I should tell you the rules," she said, not quite meeting his gaze. "I mean, the arrangement we have, so there's no misunderstanding." "I'm listening." "This is a partnership for practical purposes," she began, the words coming out in a careful rush, as if she'd rehearsed them. "We work the land together, share the profits and the losses, but that's where it ends. I'm not looking for romance or anything beyond honest labor and fair dealing." Elias nodded, understanding more than she probably realized. They were both running from something. He could see it in the way she held herself, hear it in the careful control of her voice. He'd made his own peace with solitude long ago, found his own ways of keeping the past at bay. "Fair enough," he said. "What about meals, washing, the day-to-day arrangements?" Relief flickered across her face at his matter-of-fact tone. "We'll take turns cooking, or cook together if the work demands it. I'll do the washing and mending. I'm better at it, and it needs doing anyway. We'll plan the work together but divide it according to our strengths. And if one of us wants to leave?" The question hung between them for a moment, heavy with implications. Eliza's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly before she answered. "Then we settle accounts fairly and part with no hard feelings," she said. "Though I hope it won't come to that." Elias studied her face, noting the determined set of her chin and the way her hands had steadied as they talked through the practical details. This was a woman who'd thought things through, who'd weighed her options carefully before making her desperate bid at the auction. He could respect that kind of calculation, even admire it. "It won't," he said simply. "I don't make promises lightly, Mrs. Holt. When I give my word, it stays given." Something in his tone seemed to reassure her, because her shoulders relaxed slightly and she managed a small smile. "Eliza," she said, "if we're going to be partners, you might as well call me by my name." "Elias," he replied, though she already knew that much. The sun was sinking toward the western peaks by the time they'd finished their initial survey of the property and its needs. Eliza busied herself preparing a simple supper of salt pork, beans, and cornbread, moving around the small kitchen with practiced efficiency. Elias stepped outside to tend to the horses and get his few belongings from his saddlebags. He didn't own much: a spare shirt, an extra pair of trousers, some basic tools, and the small leather pouch that contained what remained of his worldly wealth. Everything else he needed, he could make or find. It was a strange feeling, settling into a place with the intention of staying. For 20 years, he'd lived like smoke on the wind, never in one spot long enough to call it home. When he returned to the cabin, the smell of cooking food and the warm glow of lamplight through the windows struck him with unexpected force. It had been so long since he'd experienced the simple comfort of a home that he'd forgotten how it could reach into a man's chest and squeeze his heart. Eliza glanced up as he entered, flour dusting her hands and a strand of hair escaping from her careful bun. For a moment, neither of them spoke, both recognizing that something had shifted between them, not romance, exactly, but the first tentative stirring of trust. "Supper's almost ready," she said quietly. "Smells good," he replied, and meant it. As they sat down to their first meal together, Elias found himself thinking that maybe, just maybe, he'd made the right choice in accepting her unconventional offer. Time would tell, of course. But for the first time in longer than he cared to remember, he was looking forward to finding out. Eliza's recipe book lay open on the kitchen table, its pages yellowed with age and spotted with flour from countless meals prepared by loving hands. Her mother's careful script filled the margins with notes about adjusting quantities for large families or substituting ingredients when supplies ran low. As she turned the familiar pages by lamplight, planning meals for two instead of one, Eliza felt the weight of tradition and the hope of new beginnings mingling in her chest. The first week with Elias had settled into a rhythm more easily than she dared hope. He rose before dawn, as silent as a shadow moving through the cabin, and had usually accomplished half a day's work before she emerged from her bedroom. She'd find him mending fence posts or clearing brush, attacking each task with methodical determination that spoke of years spent making do with limited resources. This morning, she woke to the sound of an axe biting into wood. Through her window, she could see him working near the barn, his shirt already damp with sweat despite the October chill. He moved with the kind of fluid economy that came from a lifetime of physical labor, each swing precise and purposeful. A neat pile of split logs grew beside him as she watched. "You didn't need to start the firewood," she said when she brought him coffee and a thick slice of bread with jam. "I could have helped." Elias paused in his work, resting the axe head against a stump while he accepted the food gratefully. "Habit," he said between bites. "Always liked to get the heavy work done before the day got away from me." She'd learned that about him, his tendency toward understatement, his preference for action over explanation. In the evenings, when they sat by the fire planning the next day's tasks, he would listen more than he spoke. But when he did offer suggestions, they were invariably practical and well-considered. "The chicken coop needs rebuilding before winter," he'd observed on their third night together. "That lean won't stand up to heavy snow." "I know," Eliza had replied, embarrassment heating her cheeks. "I've been meaning to fix it, but I'm not much good with carpentry." "I am," he'd said simply, and that had been the end of the discussion. Now, a week later, she watched him working and marveled at how much had changed already. The chicken coop stood straight and strong, its new roof gleaming with fresh shingles. The barn door hung properly on its hinges. The worst of the overgrown brush had been cleared from the fields, revealing rich soil that would be ready for planting come spring. But it wasn't just the physical improvements that struck her. For the first time in 3 years, she wasn't facing the approach of winter with dread. There was someone else to share the burden of preparation, someone with the strength and skills to tackle the jobs that had seemed impossible when she faced them alone. "What's that you're reading?" Elias asked that evening, nodding toward the recipe book she'd been studying while he whittled shavings for kindling. "My mother's recipes," Eliza said, turning the book so he could see the faded pages. "I was thinking about what to cook for Sunday dinner. It's been a while since I had someone to cook for properly." Something flickered across his face, surprise perhaps, or pleasure. "You don't need to go to any trouble on my account." "It's not trouble," she replied, and realized she meant it. There was satisfaction in planning meals again, in considering what would best please a working man's appetite. "Besides, you've been working hard. A good meal seems like fair payment." Their fingers brushed accidentally as he reached to turn a page, and both of them pulled back as if burned. The moment of contact lasted barely a second, but it left Eliza's skin tingling and her heart beating faster than it should. She tried to tell herself it was merely surprise, but the warmth spreading through her chest suggested otherwise. "Your mother was a fine cook, I'd guess," Elias said, his voice carefully neutral. "The best in 3 counties," Eliza agreed, grateful for the return to safer conversational ground. "She could make a feast from whatever we had on hand. During the lean years, when Papa's crops failed, she kept us fed on nothing but determination and creativity." "Must have been where you learned to make something from nothing," he observed, and the quiet approval in his tone made her flush with unexpected pleasure. The next morning brought their first real disagreement. Eliza had planned to spend the day preserving the last of the garden vegetables, but when she stepped outside, she found Elias preparing to ride down to the valley. "Where are you going?" she asked, wrapping her shawl more tightly against the morning chill. "Town," he replied, checking his horse's tack with the thoroughness she'd come to expect. "We need winter supply salt, flour, coffee, things we can't make or grow ourselves." "I always do the shopping," Eliza protested. "I know the merchants, know who gives fair prices and who tries to cheat." Elias straightened, his grey eyes meeting hers steadily. "And I know what we'll need to get through a hard winter in these mountains, some things you can't learn from living in town half the time." The words stung more than they should have, carrying as they did the implication that her 3 years of struggle had been inadequate preparation. Eliza felt her jaw tighten with familiar stubborn pride. "This is my land," she said quietly. "My money paying for supplies. I should have a say in how it's spent." For a moment, they stared at each other across the morning air, both recognizing that this was about more than a simple trip to town. This was about partnership versus charity, about whether Eliza was truly his equal in their arrangement or merely someone he was helping out of pity. "You're right," Elias said finally. "We'll go together." The acknowledgement surprised her. She'd expected him to argue, to insist on his greater experience and knowledge. Instead, he'd yielded to her point, while finding a solution that honored both their concerns. "Together," she agreed, and began untying her mare from the hitching post. The ride to town gave them their first real opportunity to talk without the distraction of work. Eliza found herself sharing stories of her early years on the homestead, the mistakes she and Thomas had made, the lessons learned through trial and error. Elias listened with the same attention he gave to everything else, occasionally asking questions that showed he understood both the challenges she'd faced and the knowledge she'd gained. By the time they reached Silver Hollow, something had shifted between them. They were no longer two strangers bound by a desperate bargain, but partners beginning to understand each other's strengths and limitations. It was a small step, but it felt like the foundation for something larger. As they loaded supplies into the wagon, salt and flour and coffee, but also nails and leather and other materials Elias insisted they'd need, Eliza caught herself stealing glances at her new partner. He moved through the world with quiet confidence, treating shopkeepers and passers-by with the same measured respect he showed her. There was something deeply appealing about his steadiness, his refusal to be ruffled by the curious stares and whispered comments their partnership inevitably drew. On the ride home, as the familiar mountains rose around them and the cabin came into view, Eliza realized she was looking forward to the evening's quiet companionship, to planning tomorrow's work over supper, to the comfortable rhythm they were slowly creating together. It wasn't love, she was careful to remind herself of that. But it was something warmer than mere partnership, something that made the approaching winter seem less like an enemy to be endured and more like a season to be shared. The hand-carved wooden cradle sat in the corner of Eliza's bedroom, draped with a dust cloth that couldn't quite hide its gentle curves and careful craftsmanship. Thomas had spent 3 months carving it during her first pregnancy, working by lamplight after long days clearing land, his calloused fingers smoothing every surface until it was silk-soft and perfect. Now it stood as a monument to dreams that had died with fever and tiny graves beneath the pines. November had arrived with the first serious snowfall, blanketing the mountains in pristine white and turning the world outside their cabin into something from a fairy tale. Inside, the warmth from their improved stove created a cocoon of comfort that made the long evenings pass more quickly than Eliza had expected. She and Elias had fallen into the habit of sitting by the fire after supper, she with her mending or knitting, he carving or repairing tools that would be needed come spring. It was during one of these quiet evenings that the subject of the past finally surfaced between them like a deep current rising to break the smooth surface of a pond. "You don't talk about them much," Elias observed, his knife pausing in its careful work on what was becoming a new axe handle. "Your family, I mean." Eliza's needle stilled in the sock she was darning, her throat tightening with the familiar ache that accompanied any mention of Thomas and the children. She'd grown skilled at avoiding the topic, redirecting conversations away from dangerous ground, with the practiced ease of someone who'd learned that grief shared too freely could drive people away. "It hurts less if I don't," she said quietly, then immediately regretted the admission. It revealed too much, made her seem weak and broken, instead of the capable partner she'd tried to be. But Elias didn't look uncomfortable or eager to change the subject. Instead, he set down his carving and gave her the same focused attention he brought to everything else in his life. "Tell me about Thomas," he said simply. The request caught her off guard. Most people, when they bothered to mention her late husband at all, spoke in the careful platitudes reserved for the recently bereaved. They talked about God's plan and better places, and how she should be grateful for the time she'd had. No one had ever simply asked her to share memories of the man she'd loved. "He was younger than me," she began hesitantly, her voice barely above a whisper. 3 years younger, but so sure of himself, so full of plans and dreams. When he proposed, he told me we'd build an empire in these mountains. I laughed at him, told him he was too young to know what an empire required. "But you married him anyway." "I married him anyway," she confirmed, a small smile tugging at her lips despite the tears gathering in her eyes. He was impossible to resist when he set his mind on something, like a force of nature, gentle but unstoppable. The words came easier after that, spilling out like water through a broken dam. She told him about Thomas's infectious optimism, his terrible singing voice, the way he'd dance with her in the kitchen while their supper burned on the stove. She described little Mary's serious grey eyes and her habit of following field mice with the focused attention of a born naturalist. She spoke of baby Samuel's laughing disposition and the way he'd kick his feet when she sang to him. "They died within 10 days of each other," she said finally, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. "The fever came through in late winter, took half the children in the valley before it burned itself out. I nursed them day and night, tried everything I knew, but—" Her voice broke then, and she couldn't continue. Elias moved from his chair to kneel beside hers, not touching but close enough that she could feel his warmth and strength. "Fever's a hard thing," he said quietly. "Takes the good ones as often as not, leaves the rest of us wondering why we were spared." Something in his tone made her look up, studying his weathered face in the firelight. There was understanding there, the kind that came only from personal experience with loss. "You've lost people too," she said, and it wasn't a question. For a long moment he didn't answer. Then, so quietly she had to strain to hear him, he said, "A wife, a daughter, different sickness, same ending." The admission hung between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm. Eliza felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of the tight knot of isolation she'd carried for 3 years. Here was someone who truly understood, who knew the particular agony of watching loved ones slip away despite every effort to save them. "What were their names?" she asked. "Sarah and Emma." His voice was rough with old pain. Sarah was like you, strong, determined, stubborn as a mule when she set her mind on something. Emma was 5 when she died. Had Sarah's eyes and my thick skull. They sat in silence for a while, the fire crackling between them while snow continued to fall outside. Finally, Eliza reached over and touched his hand where it rested on his knee. His skin was warm and rough with calluses, solid and real, in a world that had taken so much from both of them. "I'm sorry," she said. "I'm sorry too," he replied, turning his hand palm up to clasp her fingers gently. The storm that arrived 2 days later tested their preparations and their growing partnership in ways neither had anticipated. The wind howled like a living thing, driving snow horizontally across the valley and piling drifts against the cabin walls. For 3 days, they were trapped inside, while the world outside disappeared in a white fury that reminded them both how small and vulnerable they were against the mountain's power. But instead of the claustrophobic tension Eliza had expected, the enforced closeness brought unexpected comfort. They worked together to keep the fire going and the cabin warm, sharing stories and quiet conversation while the storm raged around them. Elias proved to have a dry sense of humor that surprised her, and she found herself laughing more than she had in years. On the second day, when the cold became so intense that even their improved stove struggled to heat the main room, Elias suggested they move their bedding closer to the fire for warmth. They slept on opposite sides of the room, carefully maintaining the boundaries they'd established, but Eliza was acutely aware of his presence throughout the night. The sound of his steady breathing was oddly comforting, a reminder that she was no longer facing the mountain's challenges alone. When the storm finally broke on the 4th morning, they emerged to find a world transformed. Snow lay 4 feet deep in places, sculpted by the wind into fantastic shapes that caught the morning light like scattered diamonds. Their preparations had served them well. The cabin was snug and warm, their supplies adequate, their animals safe in the reinforced barn. "We did good," Elias said, surveying their small domain with satisfaction. "We did," Eliza agreed, and realized that somewhere during the long, quiet days of the storm, the careful distance between them had begun to close. They were still partners, still bound by practical necessity, but something warmer was growing between them, something that felt like the beginning of trust, and perhaps something more. The quilt spread across Elias's narrow bed was a patchwork testament to his unexpected domesticity, rough squares of fabric salvaged from worn-out shirts and patched together with uneven but determined stitches. He'd worked on it during the long winter evenings, his large hands surprisingly gentle as they guided the needle through layers of cloth and batting. It wasn't beautiful in any conventional sense, but it was warm and serviceable, much like the man who'd made it. Spring had arrived late that year, creeping into the mountains with tentative fingers of green and the tentative songs of returning birds. The snow retreated grudgingly, leaving behind muddy patches that gradually expanded into brown earth, eager for seed and cultivation. Eliza stood at her kitchen window, watching Elias work in what would soon be their expanded garden, and marveled at how natural the word "there" had become. The winter had changed them both, she realized. The forced intimacy of storm-bound days had worn away the careful politeness that had marked their early partnership, replacing it with the comfortable familiarity of people who'd seen each other at their worst and found they could still bear the sight. Elias no longer apologized for tracking mud across her floors, and she no longer felt the need to ask permission before mending his clothes or planning his meals. More than that, she'd caught herself watching him work with an appreciation that had little to do with his practical skills. There was something deeply attractive about his quiet competence, the way he approached each task with patient concentration until it was done properly. When he rolled up his sleeves to repair the water wheel that powered their small mill, the sight of his forearm scored with muscle and marked with old scars and heat pooling in places she'd forgotten could feel such things. "The fence posts are ready," he called from the garden, straightening to wipe sweat from his brow despite the cool morning air. "Should we start setting them today, or do you want to finish the seed bed first?" "Fence first," Eliza called back, tying an apron over her work dress. "I don't want the deer getting into the vegetables before they're even planted." They'd developed an easy rhythm of consultation over the winter, neither assuming command, but both contributing to decisions based on their particular knowledge and experience. It was a more equal partnership than Eliza had ever imagined possible between a man and woman, built on mutual respect rather than the traditional assumption that masculine authority naturally trumped feminine wisdom. As they worked together that morning, setting posts and stringing wire in the warming sun, Eliza found herself stealing glances at her partner. Somewhere during the dark months, Elias had begun to seem less like a stranger she'd hired, and more like, well, she wasn't quite ready to put words to what he'd become. But the careful walls she'd built around her heart were developing cracks, and warm feelings were seeping through despite her best efforts to maintain their practical arrangement. "Eliza," Elias said suddenly, his voice carrying an odd note of tension. She looked up from the post she was bracing to find him staring down the mountain path, his body gone still in the way she'd learned meant potential trouble. Following his gaze, she spotted a small group of riders making their way up the winding trail toward their homestead. "Company," she murmured, shading her eyes against the sun to make out the approaching figures. "That's Mayor Hutchins in front. Don't recognize the others." Elias's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but his voice remained calm. "Official business, you think?" "Probably." Eliza set down her tools and smoothed her skirts, already dreading whatever brought the mayor so far from town, with unknown companions. In her experience, unexpected official visits rarely brought good news. The group consisted of 4 men, Mayor Hutchins looking uncomfortable in his town clothes, 2 strangers in better suits who had the look of officials or lawyers, and Ben Morrison, the young miner who'd been courting the blacksmith's daughter all winter. Ben tipped his hat to her with an embarrassed smile, but the strangers studied her, and Elias with the cool assessment of men accustomed to passing judgment on other people's lives. "Mrs. Holt," Mayor Hutchins began, dismounting with obvious reluctance, "I hope we're not interrupting your work, but these gentlemen insisted on speaking with you and Mr. Morrison." Circuit Judge Harrison, the older stranger, introduced himself with curt efficiency. "This is Deputy Marshal Crawford. We're here to investigate reports about your arrangement." The word fell between them like a stone into still water, heavy with implications and unspoken accusations. Eliza felt heat rise in her cheeks, but her voice remained steady when she replied. "What kind of reports?" "That you're living in sin," Judge Harrison said bluntly. "Unmarried persons of opposite sexes, cohabiting without proper religious or legal sanction. It's a violation of territorial law and public decency." "We have a business partnership," Eliza replied, her tone growing cooler. "Nothing more. Mr. Morrison works my land in exchange for room and board. I fail to see how that constitutes a violation of anything." Deputy Marshal Crawford spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the flat authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Ma'am, with respect, 2 people living alone together for months raises natural questions about the nature of their relationship, particularly when one of them bid on the other at a public auction like livestock." Elias stepped slightly forward, not quite placing himself between Eliza and the officials, but clearly marking his position in the conversation. "Mrs. Holt has been nothing but proper in all her dealings," he said quietly. "Any man who suggests otherwise will answer to me." The threat was delivered without heat or bluster, but something in Elias's tone made both officials take an instinctive step backward. Eliza felt a flutter of warmth at his defense of her reputation, even as she recognized the danger such protection might bring. "No one's questioning anyone's character," Judge Harrison said hastily. "But appearances matter, especially in a community trying to establish itself as civilized and respectable. The territorial government takes a dim view of irregular arrangements, particularly when they involve property and inheritance issues. "What exactly are you suggesting?" Eliza asked, though she suspected she already knew. "Marriage," Deputy Marshal Crawford said bluntly. "A proper legal ceremony that makes your arrangement legitimate in the eyes of God and the law. Or separation, Mr. Morrison finds other accommodations, and you either remarry within the bounds of propriety or sell your land to someone capable of working it alone." The ultimatum hung in the air between them, as stark and unforgiving as a winter storm. Eliza felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came with being cornered, with having her choices stripped away by men who thought they knew what was best for her life. But before she could respond, Elias's hand found hers, his calloused fingers intertwining with her own in a gesture that was both protective and claiming. "How long do we have to decide?" he asked, his voice steady despite the momentous nature of the question. 2 weeks, Judge Harrison replied. "I'll be back through this circuit at the end of the month. Have your answer ready then." As the officials mounted their horses and rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and uncomfortable silence in their wake, Eliza realized that everything was about to change once again. The comfortable partnership they'd built through the winter was no longer enough. Now they would have to choose between a deeper commitment and losing everything they'd worked to build together. The question was whether either of them was brave enough to risk their hearts on something more than mere survival. The faded photograph lay face down in the bottom of Elias's leather saddlebag, beneath spare clothes and basic tools, as if he'd tried to bury it under the weight of practical necessities. Eliza discovered it by accident while helping him organize his belongings for a hunting trip, her fingers brushing against the stiff paper as she searched for his extra ammunition pouch. She almost didn't. Look, privacy was something they'd both guarded carefully through their months together. But something about the careful way the photograph had been wrapped in oiled cloth, protected from moisture and time, suggested it held significance beyond mere sentiment. When she finally turned it over, her breath caught in her throat. A young woman smiled back at her from the sepia-toned image, her face radiant with happiness as she held a small girl on her lap. The child had Elias's unmistakable grey eyes and stubborn chin, while the woman possessed a beauty that was both delicate and strong. At the bottom, in fading ink, someone had written, "Sarah and Emma Morrison, 1855. Eliza's hands trembled as she studied the faces of Elias's lost family, seeing in their expressions all the love and hope that had once filled his world. The woman Sarah looked to be about Eliza's age, though her face held none of the lines that grief and hardship had etched around Eliza's own eyes. This was a woman who'd known happiness, who'd believed in the future, who'd had no reason to expect that death would steal everything she held dear. The sound of boots on the porch made her quickly rewrap the photograph and place it back where she'd found it, but the image burned in her memory like a brand. When Elias entered the cabin, she was standing by the window with her back to him, ostensibly watching the clouds gather over the peaks, but actually struggling to compose herself. "Everything ready for the hunting trip?" he asked, beginning to pack his rifle and the supplies she'd prepared. "Yes," she managed, her voice sounding strange even to her own ears. "I put extra salt pork in case you're gone longer than expected." Something in her tone must have alerted him, because he paused in his preparations and studied her with those perceptive grey eyes. Something wrong? For a moment, Eliza considered pretending everything was normal, maintaining the careful balance they'd achieved. But the weight of what she'd discovered, combined with the pressure from Judge Harrison's ultimatum, made deception impossible. "I found the photograph," she said quietly, still not turning to face him. The silence that followed was so complete she could hear her own heartbeat. When Elias finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled, stripped of all emotion. "I should have told you." "Yes," Eliza agreed, finally turning to meet his gaze. "You should have." The pain in his eyes was raw and immediate, as if someone had torn away a carefully constructed bandage to reveal a wound that had never properly healed. For a moment, he looked like a man drowning, struggling against currents too strong for any swimmer to overcome. "They died of typhoid fever," he said finally, the words coming out flat and mechanical. "Sarah first, then Emma 3 days later. I was away on a trapping expedition, gone for 2 weeks to check my lines up in the high country. When I came back..." His voice broke, and he turned away, gripping the edge of the table with white knuckles. Eliza wanted to go to him, to offer comfort, but something held her back. This wasn't just about his grief, it was about what his grief meant for them. "That's why you came to these mountains," she said, understanding flooding through her. "You weren't just seeking solitude, you were running from the guilt." "I should have been there." The words came out like a confession torn from his soul. "Should have been there to get help, to nurse them, to at least say goodbye. Instead, I was chasing pelts and profits while my family died alone." "Elias, I killed them," he continued, his voice gaining strength as he voiced the terrible conviction that had driven him into exile. "As surely as if I'd put a gun to their heads. I chose money over my family, and they paid the price for my selfishness." The stark self-condemnation in his words made Eliza's heart ache, but it also awakened a cold fear in her chest. She thought of their growing closeness, the warmth that had been building between them despite their careful boundaries, the possibility of love that had begun to seem within reach. "Is that what I am to you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "A replacement for what you lost? A chance to ease your guilt by saving someone else's family?" The question hung between them like a blade, sharp and cutting. Elias's head snapped up, his eyes wide with something that might have been horror. "No," he said quickly. "Eliza, it's not." "Isn't it?" The words came out sharper than she'd intended, driven by a pain she hadn't expected to feel so keenly. "You see a widow struggling to survive, children's graves in the yard, and suddenly you have a chance to be the hero you weren't before, to prove that you've learned from your mistakes. That's not fair." "Fair?" Eliza laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Was it fair when you let me believe?" She stopped herself, unwilling to voice the hopes she'd barely acknowledged even to herself. "Believe what?" Elias asked, his voice rough with emotion. "That this was real," she whispered, "that maybe, somehow, 2 broken people had found something worth rebuilding together." The admission hung between them, vulnerable and raw. Elias stared at her for a long moment, his face cycling through expressions of pain, longing, and something that might have been despair. "It is real," he said finally. "What I feel for you, it's not about Sarah or Emma or trying to make amends for the past. It's about you, Eliza. About the way you fight for what's yours, the way you've built something from nothing, the way you make me believe I might deserve a second chance at happiness." "How can I trust that?" she asked, tears beginning to track down her cheeks. "How can I know you're not just seeing what you want to see, trying to recapture something you lost?" The question seemed to deflate him, and he sank into a chair, as if the weight of his guilt had finally become too much to bear standing under. "I don't know," he admitted. "I've been carrying this for so long, I'm not sure I know the difference anymore between what's real and what's wishful thinking." They stood in opposite corners of the cabin that had become their shared world, separated by a chasm of doubt and old pain that seemed impossible to bridge. Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall, pattering against the windows like tears. "Judge Harrison wants an answer in 2 weeks, Eliza said eventually. "I know. I can't marry you wondering if you're seeing my face or hers when you look at me," she continued, her voice steady despite the tears. "I won't be someone's attempt at redemption." Elias nodded slowly, accepting the justice of her words, even as they clearly cut him deeply. "What do you want me to do?" The question was simple, but the answer felt impossibly complex. What did she want? For him to prove his feelings were genuine? For him to somehow erase a past that had shaped him as surely as her own losses had shaped her? For him to choose between his dead family and his living partner? "I want you to go on your hunting trip," she said finally. "Take the time away to figure out what you really want, what you can honestly offer, and when you come back, we'll both know whether we have something worth fighting for." Elias gathered his gear in silence, his movements mechanical and precise. At the door, he paused and looked back at her, his eyes holding a depth of regret that seemed bottomless. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "I never meant for you to be a replacement for anything. You're not Sarah, and I'm grateful for that. You're stronger than she ever was, braver than I deserve, and if I lose you because of my own stupidity, it'll be the second worst mistake of my life." With that, he was gone, leaving Eliza alone with her doubts and the echo of rain against glass. Through the window, she watched him disappear into the forest and wondered if she'd just saved herself from heartbreak or thrown away the best thing that had happened to her since Thomas died. Only time would tell, and time suddenly seemed like an enemy rather than an ally. The blank marriage certificate lay on Mayor Hutchins's desk like a door to an uncertain future, its official seals and formal language promising legal recognition for a union that might never exist. Judge Harrison had left it behind as a tangible reminder of the choice that loomed ahead: marry or separate, conform or lose everything they'd built together. Eliza stared at the document through the mayor's office window, her hands pressed against the glass as if she could somehow divine the right answer from its formal script and empty signature lines. 5 days had passed since Elias disappeared into the high country, 5 days of sleepless nights and endless worry that alternated between concern for his safety and anger at his abandonment. "Still no word from him?" Martha asked, settling beside her friend on the wooden bench outside the mayor's office. The older woman's weathered face showed the kind of patient sympathy that came from watching too many people struggle with impossible choices. "Nothing," Eliza replied, her voice hoarse from a combination of tears and stubborn pride. "He could be anywhere in those mountains, could be hurt or lost or thinking," Martha interrupted gently. "Sometimes a man needs to get far from the problem before he can see it clearly." Eliza pulled her shawl tighter against the spring chill, watching the bustle of Silver Hollow's main street without really seeing it. The town had grown again over the winter, new businesses opening to serve the expanding mining operations, more families arriving to chase dreams of prosperity in the thin mountain air. It should have been encouraging, this sign of civilization taking root, but instead it only emphasized how precarious her own position had become. "What if he doesn't come back?" she asked quietly. "What if this was all just too much the past, the pressure, the complications? What if he decided it was easier to disappear than face Judge Harrison's deadline?" Martha was quiet for a long moment, studying her friend's profile with the careful attention of someone who'd learned to read the subtle signs of heartbreak. "Do you love him?" she asked finally. The question hung in the air between them, simple and devastating. Eliza had been avoiding it for days, focusing instead on practical concerns and wounded pride. But Martha's direct approach cut through all her careful defenses. "I don't know," Eliza whispered. "I thought I might, but now how can I love someone I'm not sure I really know?" "Honey," Martha said with the kind of gentle firmness that brooked no argument, "none of us ever really know another person completely. We just know enough to decide whether we want to take the risk of finding out the rest." Before Eliza could respond, the sound of hoofbeats drew their attention to the road leading up from the valley. A single rider approached at a steady pace, but even from a distance, Eliza could tell it wasn't Elias. This horse and rider were smaller, moving with the determined efficiency of someone carrying important news. Young Ben Morrison pulled up in front of the mayor's office, his face flushed with excitement and exertion. He'd been working a claim high up near Devil's Creek all winter, and his sudden appearance in town suggested either very good news or very bad. "Mrs. Holt," he called out, dismounting with the awkward haste of youth. "I've got a message for you, from Elias." Eliza's heart lurched, relief and anxiety warring in her chest. "Is he all right? Where is he?" "He's fine," Ben assured her quickly. "Camped up near Eagle's Rest, where the old trapper's cabin used to be. He asked me to bring you this." He pulled a folded piece of paper from his coat pocket, the rough edges suggesting it had been torn from a journal or notebook. Eliza's hands shook slightly as she unfolded it, recognizing Elias's careful script in the few lines written there. "Eliza, I found something that changes things. If you're willing to trust me one more time, meet me at the old oak grove where your family is buried, tomorrow at sunset. Come alone. If you don't come, I'll understand, and I'll be gone before Judge Harrison returns. Whatever you decide, know that you were never a replacement for anything. You were the chance at something entirely new. E." The message raised more questions than it answered, but something in its tone hopeful rather than desperate, determined rather than pleading made Eliza's pulse quicken with possibilities she didn't dare name. "Did he say anything else?" she asked Ben, who was watching her with the obvious curiosity of youth. "Just that he hoped you'd come," Ben replied, "and that if you didn't, I should tell you he understood why." That night, Eliza lay awake, staring at the ceiling of her lonely cabin, turning the message over in her mind like a puzzle she couldn't quite solve. What could he have found in the mountains that would change anything? What could possibly bridge the chasm that had opened between them when she'd discovered the truth about his past? Part of her wanted to ignore the message entirely, to let Judge Harrison's deadline pass without a decision and accept whatever consequences followed. It would be easier than risking her heart again, simpler than trying to untangle the complex emotions that Elias's revelation had stirred up. But another part of her, the part that had bid on a stranger at a bachelor auction, that had fought to keep her land when everyone said she should sell, that had survived 3 years of grief and hardship through sheer stubborn will refused to let fear make her choices for her. The next day passed with agonizing slowness. Eliza went through the motions of her daily routine, feeding the animals, tending the garden, preparing meals she barely touched, but her mind remained fixed on the approaching sunset and the choice it would force her to make. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen, she found herself standing before her mirror, studying her reflection with the critical eye of a woman preparing for battle. The face that looked back at her showed the marks of loss and struggle, but also the strength that had carried her through the worst years of her life. Whatever Elias had to say, whatever he'd discovered in his mountain solitude, she would face it with dignity and clear eyes. She chose her blue dress again, the one Thomas had admired, the one she'd worn to the bachelor auction that had started this entire complicated journey. It seemed fitting somehow, a way of honoring both her past and whatever future might be waiting for her in the grove where her children slept. The walk to the burial ground took her through familiar territory, past the fields she and Elias had worked together, the fence posts they'd set, the small improvements that bore witness to their partnership. Each landmark carried memories now, moments of shared labor and growing trust that seemed both precious and painful in light of recent revelations. The old oak grove stood on a gentle rise above the cabin, its ancient trees offering shelter and peace to the 3 small graves marked with carefully carved wooden crosses. Thomas had chosen the spot during their first spring on the land, saying it felt like a place where souls could rest easy. Now, as evening light filtered through the new leaves overhead, Eliza understood what he'd meant. She arrived early, wanting time to compose herself before whatever confrontation awaited. Kneeling beside her children's graves, she traced the familiar letters of their names and tried to imagine what they would think of the choices she'd made, the risks she'd taken in her desperate attempt to honor their father's dreams. "I hope I haven't made a terrible mistake," she whispered to the gathering dusk. "I hope you'd understand why I had to try." The sound of approaching footsteps made her look up, her heart hammering as Elias emerged from the tree line. He looked different somehow, not just from days in the wilderness, though his clothes were travel-worn and his face weathered by wind and sun. There was something in his posture, his expression, that spoke of a man who'd found answers to questions that had tormented him. In his hands, he carried something wrapped in rough cloth, a bundle too large to be the photograph that had started their troubles, too carefully protected to be mere wilderness findings. Whatever he'd discovered, whatever had given him the confidence to call her here, lay hidden beneath those simple coverings. "Thank you for coming," he said quietly, stopping a respectful distance from the graves. "I wasn't sure you would." "I almost didn't," Eliza admitted. rising to face him across the sacred ground where her past lay buried and her future waited to be decided. The sun had nearly touched the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that matched the hope and fear warring in her heart. Whatever happened next would determine not just their fate, but whether the love that had been growing between them was strong enough to survive the weight of their shared sorrows. In the fading light of the mountain evening, with the graves of her children as witness, Eliza waited to learn whether redemption was possible for two broken souls who dared to dream of healing together. Eliza's mother's wedding dress hung from the cabin's main beam like a ghost from happier times, its ivory silk yellowed with age but still beautiful in the lamplight. She'd altered it through the long, sleepless night before Judge Harrison's return, taking in the waist and shortening the sleeves with careful stitches that trembled with both exhaustion and anticipation. The dress that had once symbolized her mother's hope for the future now carried the weight of her own impossible choice. What Elias had revealed in the oak grove 3 days ago had changed everything, yet left everything uncertain. The bundle he'd carried contained not treasures or explanations, but simple tool-sir hammer worn smooth by his father's hands, a plane that had shaped countless pieces of furniture, chisels marked with the initials J.M. for Josiah Morrison, the grandfather Elias had never mentioned. "I went up to the old homestead," he'd told her, as darkness gathered around them in the sacred grove. "The place where I grew up, where my parents built their first cabin. I hadn't been back since Sarah and Emma died. Couldn't bear to see it falling apart, another reminder of my failures." His voice had been steady as he unwrapped each tool, handling them with the reverence due to sacred relics. "But something you said made me realize I'd been running from the wrong things. You asked if I was trying to replace what I'd lost, and I couldn't answer because I didn't know myself anymore." The old homestead had been reclaimed by wilderness, but the workshop his father had built remained solid beneath its covering of vines and fallen leaves. Inside, Elias had found not just tools, but understanding wooden toys carved with patient love, furniture built to last generations, a cradle that had held him as a baby, and later his own daughter. "My father made beautiful things," Elias had continued, his eyes distant with memory. Not because he had to, but because he loved the work itself. The feel of wood shaping under his hands, the satisfaction of creating something that would outlast him. He used to say that a man's real legacy wasn't what he accumulated, but what he built with his own hands and heart. Standing now before her mother's dress, Eliza understood what he'd been trying to tell her. It wasn't about replacing his lost family or assuaging his guilt. It was about choosing to build rather than simply survive, to create something new rather than mourning what was gone. But understanding and trusting were different things entirely. A knock at the door interrupted her troubled thoughts. Through the window, she could see Judge Harrison's official party arriving precisely on schedule, their horses raising dust clouds in the morning air. Deputy Marshal Crawford sat stern-faced in his saddle, while Mayor Hutchins fidgeted nervously beside them. Ben Morrison lingered at the edge of the group, clearly uncomfortable with his role as witness to whatever would unfold. "Mrs. Holt," Judge Harrison called out in his formal courtroom voice, "the time has come for your decision. Are you prepared to proceed with a legal marriage ceremony, or shall we discuss alternative arrangements for your property?" Eliza's hand smoothed the silk of her mother's dress one final time before she opened the door. The morning air carried the scent of pine and possibility, but also the harsh reality of choice that could no longer be postponed. "Where is Mr. Morrison?" Deputy Crawford asked, scanning the property with suspicious eyes. Surely he should be present for this discussion. "He'll be here," Eliza said with more confidence than she felt. She'd sent word through Ben about the time and place, but Elias's response had been characteristically minimala, simple nod and promise to be ready. For what, he hadn't specified. As if summoned by her words, the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew everyone's attention to the mountain path. Elias emerged from the trees riding his steady gelding, but he wasn't alone. Behind him came an unexpected procession, Martha, from the saloon, several miners' wives, even old Dr. Pemberton, who served as the town's unofficial minister when circuit preachers weren't available. "What's all this?" Judge Harrison asked, clearly displeased by the larger audience than he'd expected. "Wedding guests," Elias said simply, dismounting with the calm deliberation that marked all his movements. He'd cleaned up for the occasion, his best shirt pressed, his hair neatly combed, his boots polished to a dull shine. But it was his eyes that caught Eliza's attention, clear and determined in a way she hadn't seen since before their devastating conversation. "Mrs. Holt hasn't yet indicated her willingness to proceed," Deputy Crawford pointed out officiously. Elias turned to face Eliza directly, ignoring the circle of officials and witnesses that surrounded them. In his hands, he held something small and simple, plain gold bands that caught the morning light. "Eliza," he said, his voice carrying across the clearing with quiet strength. "I can't promise I won't make mistakes. I can't promise the past won't sometimes make me foolish or afraid. But I can promise that every day I wake up beside you will be a gift I never expected to receive twice in one lifetime." The words hung in the air between them, honest and vulnerable and entirely his own. This wasn't the desperate plea of a man trying to escape his guilt or the calculated proposal of someone seeking convenience. This was Elias offering her his heart, scarred and imperfect as it was, with no guarantee except his willingness to risk everything on the chance that love might triumph over fear. Eliza looked around the circle of faces, some friendly, some official, all waiting for her answer to a question that would determine not just her own future, but the future of everything she and Elias had built together. The morning sun climbed higher, warming the air and casting long shadows across the mountain valley that had become her home. In the distance, she could hear the sound of the creek running strong with snowmelt, carrying away the winter's burden and making space for whatever spring might bring. The wedding rings caught the morning sunlight as they lay in Elias's palm, simple bands forged by Silver Hollow's blacksmith from gold nuggets he'd carried down from his claims in the high country. They weren't elaborate or expensive, but they'd been made with care by hands that understood the weight of promises and the strength required to keep them. Eliza stared at the rings, then at Elias's face, seeing in his grey eyes all the hope and fear that mirrored her own feelings. The gathered witnesses held their breath. Even the birds seemed to pause their morning songs, as if the entire mountain world waited for her answer to a question that had taken months to properly ask. "I have conditions," she said finally, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. Judge Harrison stepped forward, clearly prepared to assert legal authority over whatever personal drama was unfolding, but Elias silenced him with a look that brooked no interference. "Name them," Elias said quietly. "This isn't about healing your guilt or mine," Eliza began, the words coming from a place of hard-won wisdom. "We're not trying to bring back the dead or replace what we've lost. We're choosing to build something new, together, from who we are now." "Agreed. If we do this, if we really do this, then we're partners in everything. Not just the work, not just the legal arrangement, but in the hopes and fears and daily choices that make a life. I won't be the woman you take care of, and you won't be the man I depend on. We'll be equals who choose each other, every day." Something in Elias's expression shifted, a tension releasing that she hadn't even realized he'd been carrying. "Yes," he said, and the single word carried the weight of an oath. "And one more thing," Eliza continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "I need to know that when you look at me, you see me. Not Sarah, not the family you lost, not the woman you think you should have saved. Just me, Eliza, with all my flaws and stubbornness and—" "I see you," Elias interrupted, stepping closer. "I see the woman who bid on a stranger because she refused to give up on her dreams. I see someone strong enough to survive 3 years of grief and still believe in tomorrow. I see the person who makes me want to be better than I was yesterday, not because I owe it to the past, but because you deserve the best I can give." The words broke something loose in Eliza's chest, some final wall of resistance crumbling under the honest weight of his declaration. She reached for the rings, her fingers brushing his palm as she lifted the smaller band. "Then yes," she said, her voice clear enough to carry to the edges of the gathered crowd. "Yes, I'll marry you, Elias Morrison. Not because I have to, not because it's practical, but because I love you enough to risk my heart on the possibility that we can make something beautiful together." The cheer that rose from their unofficial wedding party startled a flock of crows from the nearby pines, their cawing adding a wild note to the celebration. Martha dabbed at her eyes with her apron, while Dr. Pemberton stepped forward with the dignified air of a man accustomed to presiding over life's momentous occasions. "Well then," the elderly doctor said, his voice carrying the gentle authority of someone who'd seen countless beginnings and endings, "shall we make this official?" The ceremony that followed was unlike any wedding Eliza had ever imagined. No church bells or elaborate decorations, no formal processional or practiced recitations. Instead, they stood beneath the open sky with their mountain valley spread below them, speaking vows they'd written in their hearts rather than memorized from prayer books. "I promise to work beside you," Elias said when his turn came, sliding the ring onto Eliza's finger with hands that remained steady despite the magnitude of the moment. "To share your burdens and your joys, to listen more than I speak, and to remember that the greatest gift I can give you is the truth of who I am, not who I think you want me to be." "I promise to trust you," Eliza replied, her own hands sure as she placed his ring. "To believe in what we're building together, to fight for it when times get hard, and to never let fear make my choices for me again. I promise to love you not as a replacement for what was lost, but as the beginning of what we can create." Dr. Pemberton's final words were simple. "By the authority vested in me by God and the territory of Colorado, I pronounce you husband and wife. What you have joined together, let no force on earth put asunder." The kiss that sealed their vows was gentle but certain, a promise of passion held in check by the knowledge that they had all the time in the world to explore what lay between them. When they broke apart, both were smiling, not the desperate relief of people who'd narrowly escaped disaster, but the quiet joy of souls who'd found their way home at last. Judge Harrison cleared his throat, clearly eager to conclude the official business. The territorial requirements had been satisfied. He announced, producing the marriage certificate with bureaucratic flourish. "Mr. and Mrs. Morrison, your union is now legally recognized." As Eliza signed her new name for the first time, she realized that the woman who'd bid on a stranger at a bachelor auction no longer existed. In her place stood someone stronger, someone willing to risk everything on love, someone ready to build a future worthy of the dreams that had carried her through the darkest years of her life. The child's toy wooden horse sat on the mantelpiece, its smooth curves and gentle expression testament to the patient skill of its creator. Elias had carved it during the long winter evenings, his large hands working with surprising delicacy to shape the piece of mountain cedar into something worthy of the child who would soon arrive. Each detail had been crafted with love, the flowing mane, the kind eyes, the sturdy legs that would survive countless hours of imaginative play. 1 year had passed since Judge Harrison had pronounced them husband and wife beneath the open sky of their mountain valley. 1 year of learning each other's rhythms, of building not just a homestead but a marriage that grew stronger with each shared season. Now, as autumn painted the peaks in shades of gold and crimson, Eliza sat in the rocking chair Elias had built for her, her hands resting on the gentle swell where their child grew. "What do you think?" Elias asked, holding up the wooden horse for her inspection. "Too simple, or just right for little hands?" Eliza smiled, remembering how tentative he'd been around her during the early weeks of their marriage, how carefully he'd asked permission for every small intimacy, until she'd finally taken his hand and placed it over her heart, telling him that they were past the need for such formal courtesies. "It's perfect," she said, reaching out to trace the horse's carved features. "Our son or daughter will treasure it." The words came easily now, this casual assumption of shared parenthood that had once seemed impossible to imagine. The baby wasn't due until spring, but already they spoke of their future child with the comfortable possessiveness of parents who'd waited long enough to appreciate the gift they'd been given. Their homestead had transformed over the year, growing from a struggling widow's desperate attempt at survival into something approaching the prosperity Thomas had once envisioned. The fields produced abundant crops, the enlarged barn sheltered healthy livestock, and the cabin itself had expanded to include a proper workshop where Elias practiced the woodworking skills inherited from his father. But the changes went deeper than mere material improvement. Silver Hollow had accepted them as a proper married couple, inviting them to social gatherings and church services, treating their union as a success story rather than the scandalous arrangement it had once appeared. Mayor Hutchins had even asked Elias to serve on the town council, recognizing his practical wisdom and calm judgment. Mrs. Morrison, a familiar voice, called from the yard, and Eliza looked up to see Martha approaching with a covered basket and her characteristic broad smile. The saloon keeper had appointed herself unofficial grandmother to their expected child, arriving weekly with gifts and advice neither solicited nor entirely unwelcome. "Just in time for coffee," Eliza called back, struggling somewhat to rise from her chair. At 7 months along, her body had begun the serious work of preparing for birth, and simple movements required more planning than she'd expected. Elias appeared at her elbow immediately, his hand steady under her arm as she found her balance. Such attentiveness might have annoyed her once, but she'd learned to recognize the difference between protection offered from love and help imposed from assumption of weakness. "How are you feeling today?" Martha asked, settling her basket on the kitchen table with the air of someone planning an extended visit. "Like I'm carrying a very active young horse," Eliza replied, laughing as the baby chose that moment to deliver a particularly energetic kick to her ribs. "I think our child is going to inherit his father's restless nature." "Or her mother's determination," Elias added, coming to stand behind Eliza's chair. His hands rested gently on her shoulders, and she leaned back against his solid warmth with the easy trust of a woman who'd learned that strength shared was strength doubled. Martha's basket yielded its usual treasures: fresh bread from the bakery, late apples from her own small orchard, and a collection of baby clothes sewn by the wives of Silver Hollow's more prosperous citizens. The outpouring of generosity from their community still surprised Eliza, who'd grown accustomed to facing life's challenges alone. "Dr. Pemberton says everything looks normal," Martha reported, settling into her favorite chair with the satisfied air of someone delivering good news. "Baby's positioned well, heartbeat strong. All the signs promising for an easy birth come spring." Easy was a relative term when it came to childbirth, as Eliza well knew, but she appreciated the optimism. This pregnancy felt different from her earlier, onesless, anxious, more confident, supported by a husband who'd already proven his worth as a partner and a community that welcomed their growing family. As afternoon faded toward evening, Martha gathered her things and prepared to return to town, but not before extracting promises about sending word immediately when labor began and accepting an invitation to Sunday dinner the following week. Alone again, Eliza and Elias settled into their evening routine with mending in her lap, he with his mother's old Bible open on the table between them. He'd been teaching himself to read properly over the winter, using the familiar words as practice, and now took turns reading aloud with Eliza as the lamp burned low. "What names have you been considering?" he asked as they prepared for bed, his hands gentle as he helped her navigate the increasingly complex process of getting comfortable for sleep. "Sarah for a girl," Eliza said without hesitation, then watched his face carefully for signs of the old pain. "If that would honor your first daughter properly." Elias was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant with memory. When he spoke, his voice carried peace rather than grief. "Sarah would be honored," he said simply, "and for a boy." "Thomas," Eliza replied. "For the same reason." They settled into bed together, Eliza's back curved against Elias's chest, while his hand rested protectively over their unborn child. Outside, the mountain wind whispered through the pines, carrying the scent of snow from the high peaks and the promise of winter's approach. But inside their cabin, warmth prevailed, the warmth of two hearts that had found healing in unexpected places, of love built on foundation of honest partnership, of hope that had survived the worst life could offer and emerged stronger for the testing. Sometimes, Eliza reflected drowsily, the greatest courage was simply the willingness to begin again.